A rich man harasses a homeless veteran completely unaware Robert Downey Jr. is watching. What happened next is what you're about to find out. The city never stopped moving. Cars rushed past, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, their eyes locked on their phones or lost in thought. The world moved fast, and those who couldn't keep up, they faded into the background. Sam knew this better than anyone. He sat against a cold brick wall, his back stiff from the unforgiving pavement. A tattered U.S. Army jacket hung loosely on his frame, the faded patches barely visible through years of wear. In his hands, a small cardboard sign with shaky handwritten letters. U.S. Army veteran, anything helps. People walked by, some slowing down just long enough to read the words before looking away, pretending they hadn't seen him. Others never looked at all. He wasn't begging. He wasn't shouting for help. He just sat there. And that, in some ways, made it worse. A gust of wind sent an empty coffee cup rolling down the sidewalk. Sam sighed, pulling his worn jacket tighter around himself. He could still remember a time when people looked up to him, when wearing this uniform meant honor, respect. Now, it was nothing more than a reminder of how far he had fallen. But this wasn't a story about pity. This was a story about what happened next. Before we continue, tell us, where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We'd love to know. And if you enjoy stories like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another one, just for you. The street carried on indifferent as ever. And then he appeared, a man in an expensive navy blue suit, phone in one hand, designer coffee cup in the other, stopped in front of Sam. He stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether Sam was even worth acknowledging. Finally, the man let out a quiet scoff and shook his head. You know, I used to respect people like you. Sam didn't react. He had heard it all before. The man tilted his head, taking a slow sip of coffee like he was savoring the moment. But look at you now. He gestured vaguely at Sam's. And this is what happens when you make bad choices. Sam kept his gaze down, jaw tightening. He knew better than to engage. Guys like this didn't want a conversation. They wanted a punching bag. But the man wasn't done. He nudged Sam's coffee cup with his expensive shoe, spilling the little change he had collected. A few coins clattered onto the pavement. Sam swallowed hard. The man smiled, satisfied. You served your country, huh? And now you serve the sidewalk. Few people had stopped to watch. Most didn't say anything. Some just walked away, unwilling to get involved. Sam could feel his hands shaking, not with fear, but with the kind of humiliation that sticks to your ribs. Then, before he could say a word, a voice cut through the air like steel. That's enough. The businessman turned, eyebrows raised. The few onlookers who had been watching suddenly seemed a lot more interested, because standing there, arms crossed, his expression, readable, was Robert Downey Jr., and everything was about to change. The businessman's smirk barely faltered as he turned to face Robert Downey Jr., but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He let out a short laugh, shifting his weight onto one foot, clearly trying to mask his surprise. Oh, great. A Hollywood star wants to play hero, he said, shaking his head. Let me guess, you're about to give me some grand speech about kindness? Robert didn't respond right away. He just looked at him, that unreadable gaze steady and calm. The kind of calm that made people nervous. The businessman's confidence wavered for half a second, but he doubled down, gesturing towards Sam without even looking at him. This guy? He's here because of his own choices. No one told him to end up like this. And if he really wanted to fix it, he wouldn't be sitting there waiting for someone else to do it for him. Sam didn't move, didn't say a word. He had heard every variation of that speech before. Maybe not from someone in a tailored suit, but the words were always the same. Robert tilted his head slightly, finally speaking. Tell me, what exactly did he do to you? The businessman blinked, thrown off by the question. What? Robert took a slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the man shift uncomfortably. I'm asking, what did he do to you? Did he take your money? Did he hurt you? Did he take something that was yours? The businessman scoffed. No, of course not. But that's not the point. People like him, they take from the system. They drain resources meant for hardworking people. Robert let out a quiet breath, nodding slightly, as if he was actually considering the man's words. Then, without looking away, he gestured toward the spilled coins on the ground. That's what he's taking, a few quarters and dimes. That's what's ruining your day? A few people in the crowd chuckled softly, the tension shifting ever so slightly. The businessman's jaw tightened. That's not what I meant. Robert's expression didn't change. Then what did you mean? Silence. The businessman glanced at the people watching, realizing they were all waiting for his answer. His bravado was starting to crack. Robert's voice was softer now, but there was an edge to it. You think success makes you better than people like him? He gestured toward Sam. It doesn't, it just makes you more visible. The businessman's lips parted slightly like he was about to respond, but nothing came out. Sam, still silent, slowly lifted his eyes to Robert, something unreadable in his gaze. The businessman let out an awkward chuckle, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. But suddenly, for the first time since this started, he wasn't so sure he was in control anymore. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the small crowd that had started to gather. The confidence he had walked in with was slipping, and he knew it. But he wasn't ready to back down just yet. Oh, I see what this is, he said, forcing a smirk. Big shot movie star steps in to make himself look good. Get the cameras rolling, folks. Robert Downey Jr. is here to save the day. Robert didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. He just studied the man in front of him, the same way he had done in countless interviews when someone thought they were smarter than they were. Then, after a beat of silence, he spoke. You don't get it, do you? His voice was calm, steady. This isn't about me. He gestured toward Sam, who sat still, watching, his expression unreadable. It's about him. It's about the fact that you walked over here, went out of your way to humiliate someone who's done nothing to you. The businessman scoffed, shaking his head. I didn't humiliate anyone. Robert's eyebrows lifted slightly. No? So kicking over his cup, calling him worthless, that was… what, motivation? You think you were helping? The businessman clenched his jaw. I'm just saying the truth. You can pretend all you want, but people like him are here because they refuse to help themselves. Robert let out a slow breath, his gaze never wavering. And you think stepping on them makes you taller? The businessman opened his mouth, then shut it. A flicker of something, doubt maybe, crossed his face, but it was gone just as quickly. He turned to the growing crowd, throwing his hands up. You people really think I'm the bad guy here? I work hard for what I have. I built myself up. I didn't expect handouts. Robert nodded as if he understood. You worked hard, and that's great. But here's what you don't seem to get. So did he. He gestured toward Sam again. You see a homeless man. I see a veteran, someone who put his life on the line, who sacrificed more than you or I ever will. And this is how he gets treated when he comes home. Sam's fingers twitched slightly at the words, but he stayed quiet, still just watching. The businessman laughed, but it was forced now. Come on. You're really trying to make me feel bad for him? Robert's eyes darkened just slightly. No, he said, voice even. I'm trying to make you feel something. Silence. For the first time, the businessman didn't have a quick response. He glanced at the crowd again, feeling the weight of their stares. He had walked into this thinking he was the one with power. But now, standing in front of Robert Downey, Jr. with a dozen strangers waiting for his next move, he realized he wasn't in control anymore. The businessman's shoulders tensed. His confidence, once unshakable, was beginning to fracture. He could feel the weight of the crowd pressing in, their silent judgment creeping under his skin. But still, he wasn't ready to admit defeat. He scoffed, shaking his head. You think this little speech changes anything? People like him aren't my problem. Robert exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw for a moment before speaking. You're right. That caught the businessman off guard. His smirk twitched, suspicious. What? Robert tilted his head slightly. You're right, he's not your problem. His voice was calm, measured. But that doesn't mean you have to be his. The businessman blinked, thrown by the simplicity of the statement. Robert stepped forward just a little, lowering his voice so only the two of them could hear. Look, I don't know what's going on in your life. Maybe you're having a bad day. Maybe you've got your own problems and this makes you feel better. But tell me this, does it? Do you feel better now? The businessman stiffened, but he didn't answer. Robert's voice stayed steady, unwavering. You talk about hard work like it's the only thing that matters. But here's the thing. You don't know his story. You don't know what he's been through. You don't know what brought him to this sidewalk. But you didn't need to. You had a choice. And you chose to step on him instead of stepping past him. The businessman swallowed, his throat working. Against the growing discomfort that no amount of bravado could hide, Robert let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. So now you have another choice. The businessman clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. Robert didn't flinch. He just stood there waiting. And then finally the businessman looked away. His face burned with something. Anger, shame, maybe both. He muttered something under his breath, then turned, stepping away from the crowd. The tension in the air loosened, like a rubber band snapping. The businessman shoved his hands into his pockets and walked away without another word. People in the crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, others simply watching as he disappeared into the sea of people. But Robert didn't care about them. He turned back to Sam. For the first time since this had started, Sam wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking directly at Robert, and in his eyes there was something that hadn't been there before. Recognition, not just of who Robert was, but of something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Dignity. Robert crouched down so he was at eye level with Sam. He didn't speak right away. He just let the moment settle. Sam's hands twitched slightly, still resting on his lap. He looked at Robert, then at the coins scattered on the pavement. His mouth opened, then closed again. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if it had forgotten how to be used. Why'd you do that? Robert let out a quiet breath, studying the man in front of him. Because someone needed to. Sam swallowed hard. He glanced at the crowd, which had mostly started to disperse now that the confrontation was over. A few lingered, watching from a distance, but the intensity had passed. His eyes flicked back to Robert. People don't usually... He stopped himself, shaking his head. It's been a long time since someone stood up for me. Robert nodded slowly. Well, it's been a long time since someone should have. Sam exhaled, running a hand over his unshaven face. I didn't ask for help. Robert smirked slightly. I didn't ask for permission. A soft chuckle left Sam's lips, barely there, but real. It faded just as quickly, replaced by something heavier. He shifted, picking up a few of the coins from the ground, his fingers stiff from the cold. People like him. They don't even see us. Robert leaned back on his heels. They see you. They just choose not to. Sam nodded slowly, absorbing that. His fingers ran over the worn edges of his old army jacket, the fabric rough against his skin. His voice was quieter now. I wasn't always like this, you know. Robert didn't press, didn't ask for details. He just nodded. I know. Sam studied him, searching for any trace of pity. He didn't find any, just understanding. And that somehow was harder to process. Robert reached into his pocket, pulling out a small card. He held it out. Sam hesitated before taking it. He glanced at the words printed neatly across the front. Veterans Outreach Program, Housing and Support Services. His fingers curled around it. You think they'll actually help? Robert's voice was steady. Only one way to find out. Sam exhaled, rubbing his thumb over the card like he was trying to make sure it was real. His jaw clenched, emotions warring behind tired eyes. Robert stood, nodding once. It's your call, Sam. Sam blinked at the sound of his own name. He hadn't told Robert that, but somehow Robert already knew. Sam stared at the card in his hand, his fingers tracing the raised print like he was trying to make sense of it. He hadn't held something that felt like a real option in a long time. Robert stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting, not pushing, not expecting, just giving him space to decide. The city around them carried on as if nothing had happened. People walked by, their conversations blending into the hum of traffic. But something had shifted. Sam could feel it. He swallowed hard. "You really think a place like this is gonna want someone like me?" Robert tilted his head slightly. "Why wouldn't they?" Sam let out a short, bitter laugh. "Because I screwed up, I came back and I don't know, I didn't adjust, I lost everything, people stopped calling, it got harder and harder to get back up. And one day I just stopped trying." Robert was quiet for a moment before he said, "Maybe it's time to start again." Sam's jaw tensed. He wanted to believe it was that simple, but it wasn't. Nothing ever was. He looked at Robert, really looked at him, and for the first time saw something that went beyond the Hollywood face. There was something behind his eyes, something real. He had been through things too. Maybe not the same things, but enough to understand. Robert exhaled. "Look, I'm not saying this is easy. I know what it's like to hit rock bottom. I know what it's like to think there's no coming back from it." He gestured toward the card. "But you've got to take the first step. No one else can do that for you." Sam looked down at the card again, his thumb pressing into the edge. His mind was fighting itself. Part of him wanted to believe this was just another empty promise, but another part, a smaller, quieter part, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was real. He inhaled deeply, rolling his shoulders like he was adjusting to the weight of the choice in front of him. His fingers tightened around the card, and he gave the smallest of nods. Robert caught it, barely there but enough. "All right then." He didn't make a big deal out of it. Just let it be. What it was, Sam let out a slow breath. "Guess I should make a call." Robert smirked. "I hear they're good people." Sam nodded again, this time with a bit more certainty. He wasn't sure where this road led, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about a time someone showed you kindness, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us all what truly matters.